Okay, so everyone tuning in right now, you're probably hearing about this whole thing with Hudson's Bay, right? Like it's kind of a big deal, this whole potential liquidation thing.
Yeah.
We've been looking at a bunch of these excerpts from News Hudson Bay. And, well, frankly, it's a pretty shocking development.
It is.
Hudson's Bay, I mean, come on, it's like a Canadian
Yeah.
institution. We're talking about a potential full liquidation of the entire business. And what we want to do today is sort of unpack that.
Okay.
Figure out, like, how did we get here? What does it actually mean for, people, jobs, the economy? And is there, like, any chance this whole thing could turn around?
Yeah.
I mean, is there any hope left?
Right.
And we know you guys are busy, so we're going to get right to it, try to give you the full picture as quickly and as clearly as possible.
Absolutely. It's a lot to take in, especially when you consider that Hudson's Bay, it's not just another retailer, right? I mean, this is a company woven into the very fabric of Canadian history. And now, as we're seeing from these News Hudson Bay reports, they're preparing to potentially wind down the entire Canadian operation. And that means all of their stores, the Hudson's Bay locations, Saks Fifth Avenue here, and even Saks off Fifth. This isn't just a couple of stores closing. We're talking about the whole enterprise.
Yeah, it's wild. And the scale of this is just massive. Over 9,000 jobs in Canada are on the line. And they have this court appearance coming up on Monday.
Right.
So it's clearly very immediate and serious.
Yeah.
So, like, where does this even come from? What's the core issue that's pushing them to this point?
Well, the News Hudson Bay pieces point to financing as the main problem.
Okay.
They just haven't been able to secure the necessary funds to keep things going. And they've been trying, apparently. They called it exhaustive efforts to find financing, but it just hasn't worked out. So that's what's led them to this liquidation plan.
Which, I mean, it's directly connected to that whole creditor protection application they filed with the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. What was it, like a week ago?
Yeah, just about a week before this liquidation announcement.
So what was the point of that filing? What does creditor protection actually do?
Basically, when a company files for creditor protection, it's a way of saying, hey, we're in serious financial trouble and we need some breathing room. It's a legal process that lets them try to reorganize their finances and get things back on track while temporarily being shielded from their creditors. But the fact that they filed for this and then a week later announced a potential liquidation, well, that suggests that the protection just didn't do enough.
So, like, they weren't able to restructure in a way that worked.
Exactly. It seems they just couldn't find a path forward even with that protection in place.
So in that initial application, what were the main financial struggles that they cited?
Well, they pointed to a few things. First, they talked about decreased consumer spending. People just aren't buying as much stuff these days.
Right.
And then there are those ongoing trade tensions between the U.S. and Canada, which, can really mess with supply chains and costs for a company like Hudson's Bay. But I think the biggest factor they mentioned was the drop in foot traffic, especially at those big downtown stores. That trend really picked up during the pandemic, and it just hasn't gone back to normal.
It's like everyone got used to shopping online.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a huge problem for traditional brick-and-mortar stores like Hudson's Bay.
So it's not just that people are buying less, it's also that they're buying differently.
Exactly. And on top of all that, you have the massive debt they're dealing with, almost $1 billion. It's a crazy amount.
Yeah, I remember that number from the report, almost $950 million to be exact. That's just an insane amount of money to owe. And it's not just one or two lenders, it's all sorts of different creditors.
Yeah, that really stood out to me in the News Hudson Bay piece. We're talking about landlords, sure, but also a whole bunch of major fashion brands. Ralph Lauren, Chanel, Columbia Sportswear, Diesel, Estee Lauder. The list goes on and on. It's like everyone's knocking on their door saying, hey, where's our money?
Yeah. Yeah, that paints a pretty clear picture of just how widespread their financial problems are. And there were those pretty dramatic details in the CFO's filing from back in March.
Oh, right, with the deferred payments and even that store lockout.
Yeah, exactly. It sounds like they were really scrambling to keep things afloat.
Yeah, the fact that they were delaying payments to all these big-name suppliers for months on end is a huge red flag. It shows that their cash flow is basically non-existent. And then you have those extreme situations, the landlord locking them out of that store in Sydney, Nova Scotia.
Wild.
And then people trying to seize merchandise at Sherway Gardens in Toronto. I mean, come on, that's not normal business practice. It shows that their relationships with some key players had really broken down. These aren't just little hiccups. They're like major warning signs.
Yeah, it's like the whole system was starting to fall apart.
Right.
And it's kind of crazy to think that just a week before all this, their whole goal was to restructure and stay alive. Like, what happened? What changed so drastically in such a short amount of time?
I think it all boils down to the debtor in possession financing they managed to secure. That kind of financing is specifically designed to help companies keep operating while they're restructuring under creditor protection. But the reporting we're seeing is calling it limited, which basically means they didn't get enough money to do a full-scale restructuring.
So they just didn't have enough cash to fix the whole business.
Right. And that probably forced them to look at other options, and a store-by-store liquidation would be a way to at least generate some cash quickly.
Okay, so let's back up a bit. What about some of the decisions they made leading up to this? In the News Hudson Bay articles, they mentioned the spin-off of the U.S. Saks locations last year.
Oh, right, after they bought Neiman Marcus and Bergdorf Goodman.
Yeah, how does that play into what's happening now?
Well, if you look at the big picture, that move essentially separated their U.S. luxury business from the Canadian operations. The idea was probably to bolster their overall luxury portfolio, but in a way, it ended up shielding the U.S. side from the financial struggles that are now hurting the Canadian part of the business.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like a strategic move that was meant to help them might have actually made them more vulnerable.
It's crazy how these things can backfire. And it's easy to forget amidst all this drama that Hudson's Bay has such a long history in Canada.
Sure.
We're talking about a company that's been around since 1670.
I know, it's mind-boggling.
Ugh.
For so many Canadians, Hudson's Bay is like a part of their childhood, their family history.
Hmm.
It's been a fixture in communities for generations. So to see it potentially disappear like this is just, oh, it's sad.
It is, and it really makes you think about how much the retail landscape is changing. And I mean, even before this, Hudson's Bay had been through a lot of ownership changes, right? Yeah, they were bought by Richard Baker back in 2008. Then they had the IPO in 2012, and then went private again in 2020, right before the pandemic hit. It's been a bit of a roller coaster.
Yeah, they've been trying to adapt to stay relevant.
Definitely. But as the News Hudson Bay report mentioned, they also struggled to keep their shareholders happy. The stock price wasn't doing great, even though they had all this valuable real estate.
Yeah, I remember that. It's like investors didn't quite know how to value them.
Yeah, there's this weird tension with a company like Hudson's Bay. You have the physical stores, which are often in prime locations, but then you have the actual retail business, which has been struggling. And they tried to connect those two things. Like back in 2020, Richard Baker was talking about how they needed patient capital and a long-term view to leverage the intersection of real estate and retail.
Right, the idea that they could use their real estate holdings to fuel their retail growth.
Exactly. But, well, it doesn't look like that worked out as planned.
Yeah, and when you think about all the store closures and layoffs they've had in the last couple of years, plus the competition from places like Simon's and, the whole rise of online shopping, it seems like that intersection was just too difficult to navigate.
Yeah, it's a tough spot to be in. So let's look at what might happen if this liquidation actually goes through. I mean, it's pretty clear what the biggest immediate impact will be, right?
Jobs.
Exactly.
Hmm.
We're talking about over 9,300 jobs across Canada potentially disappearing. It's a huge blow to the workforce.
And it's not just those people directly employed by Hudson's Bay. What about all the malls and shopping districts that rely on them as anchor tenants?
That's a big concern. Hudson's Bay stores are often massive, taking up huge amounts of space. When those spaces go vacant, it can create a ripple effect. Smaller retailers might struggle, you could see more vacancies, and it could even threaten the viability of entire shopping centers.
It's like pulling a thread that unravels the whole sweater.
It really is.
And News Hudson Bay gave a breakdown of where all these stores are. Ontario has the most, something like 32 locations, which accounts for over half of their employees. But BC, Alberta, and Quebec also have a lot, 13 each. So this isn't just an Ontario problem, it's nationwide.
Yeah, and then you have the Saks Fifth Avenue and Saks Off Fifth stores too, which are in major cities across the country. While there aren't as many of them, they still cater to a significant part of the market. So their potential closure adds another layer to this whole thing.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. But there is a tiny bit of hope, right? That Hail Mary they're talking about.
Yeah, so even though they're preparing for liquidation, they're saying there's still a chance they could pull out of this. They're desperately trying to drum up some more capital and work out deals with their main stakeholders, especially the landlords, to avoid a complete shutdown.
I mean, it sounds like a long shot, but you got to admire their tenacity.
Yeah.
And there was that quote from Liz Rodbell, their president and CEO. She talked about how hard everyone's been working and how much support they've gotten from customers and associates and how much they want to secure the necessary support from key landlords and other stakeholders to save the Bay.
Yeah, you can really feel the urgency in her words.
And the hope. It shows how much this company means to people. But with that court date looming, I mean, they're really running out of time.
Yeah, the clock is definitely ticking.
Okay, so just to sum things up, we're looking at Hudson's Bay, a company that's been a pillar of Canadian retail for over 350 years, potentially facing liquidation. They're struggling with a whole bunch of factors: declining consumer spending, trade issues, the shift to online shopping, and a mountain of debt. And this could have a major impact on thousands of jobs and the entire retail landscape across Canada.
It's a huge story with a lot of moving parts.
It is, and it really makes you think about what it all means, right? Like, beyond the headlines, what does this potential closure tell us about the future of retail? How are our shopping habits changing? And what does it say about the way we value these companies that have been a part of our lives for so long? It's something to think about.